Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this perfect night, big night, cold and rainy. I want to welcome Laura Heady from the DEC, and she is here in her only Hudson Valley appearance, and she will only be here tonight. So we're very pleased to welcome her. So thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming out. It is, the conditions driving here almost felt like it could be close to a big night, but it's a little too cold. And my philosophy is rain in the winter. If it's too warm for snow and it's too cold for amphibians, you know, why bother? I don't like this precipitation. That's not snow. So I was a little disappointed that we had rain today, not snow. But in any case, so yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I work at the Hudson River Estuary program, which is a program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So I actually work at the DEC office in New Paltz. But my position at the Estuary program is through a partnership with Cornell University and the Department of Natural Resources up in Ithaca. So we have a really nice academic kind of state agency partnership that enables our program to happen. And so tonight I'm going to be talking to you about a program I started. Gosh, now it was in 2009, the Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings Project. But also, before I get into that project specifically, I want to talk to you a little bit about the importance of wetlands and forests in the Hudson Valley. They're really the habitat for this group of species, as well as they provide so many other services and benefits to other wildlife and human communities. And I wanted to give you a little disclaimer. So, I'm not a herpetologist. I'm not a regulatory staff person at the DEC, so I don't enforce regulations. What I do is work with a lot of communities throughout the Hudson Valley to try to raise the capacity of local decision makers to increase habitat protection at the local level. So I work a lot with planning boards, town boards, environmental commissions, land trusts, and really trying to help provide the tools and resources and training necessary for local communities to know where their important resources are, you know, understand why they're important, and know what mechanisms are available to try to protect those places. So, so this project kind of fits into that as a project that I love. I love this group of amphibians. I'm amazed that I somehow grew up playing in the woods, you know, in the New Jersey, New York area, and didn't even know about them until, you know, maybe a decade or so ago. So, so I love sharing the story of this amazing group of animals with people. So tonight I'm going to, you know, do a little introduction, explain to you a little bit about the estuary program, and then talk about what is a woodland pool, what or who migrates to woodland pools, and why is this important, and why should we care, and then finally, how can you help if you're interested. I know a couple of you are already involved in this program, and as Lisa mentioned, last year and the year before, I went to a whole bunch of different places in the Hudson Valley to talk about this project. This year, just due to competing projects and a lot of other things on my plate, I'm only talking about the program tonight, but we have a website and we have a lot of other information available, which I'll talk about later, so you'll know how you can help. So for an introduction first. So how many of you have heard of the Hudson River Estuary Program, just by show of hands? Oh, good, a good lot of you. And so you've probably seen the sturgeon sign when you cross some of the streams in the watershed as a reminder that those tributaries are flowing into the Hudson River. Well, our mission at the Estuary Program is to ensure clean water, protect and restore fish and wildlife habitat, provide access to the river and opportunities to recreate on the river, but also helping the region and communities adapt to climate change, and also conserving world-famous scenery, like that beautiful view by Storm King down in the lower right. And, you know, to me, biodiversity fits in to just about all of those core missions, but we have staff working in all different program areas. We have, you know, my colleague Beth Ressler works on the Trees for Tributaries program, Trees for Tribs, to help communities restore stream buffers. My colleague Kristen Marcel works on climate change outreach, and I understand Rhinebeck is a climate smart community. So we have a whole team of different staff that are really, you know, most of us, if not all of us, are working a lot with local municipalities. So just think of us as a resource at the Estuary Program, and if you have time, take a look at our website and see what kinds of opportunities there are to help your community. Now, the Hudson River Estuary watershed is the area bounded by that green line on the map. And that's all that land area that's flowing into or draining into the Hudson River, which is the light blue line in the center. And I apologize, I'm out of practice and I forgot my laser pointer. But so that, the tidal portion of the river flows all the way north to the Troy Dam, which is up near the top of the map by Rensselaer and Albany. And that area is 13.5% of New York State. But we have over half of New York's population. So it's a lot of people in a small part of New York State. Are you pulling out a laser pointer, Lucy?
I have to point it down.
You're wonderful. And in that area, there's 260 municipalities. So, and we work, and if you notice, the green boundary very closely follows pretty well the boundaries of the 10 counties that are along the river. So starting down at Rockland and Westchester and moving northward, Orange, Putnam, and so forth, all the way up to Albany and Rensselaer. And since so many of the conservation actions we're hoping to see happen occur at the municipal level, really the people in the trenches making decisions about land use are community volunteers. So we really think of the 10 counties as our focus area with our biodiversity outreach and technical assistance, and it's convenient that it follows the watershed boundary so well. So 260 municipalities, that's cities, villages, and towns, all with their own local decision-making bodies. About 89% of the land area in that watershed is privately owned. The rest is, state parks, county parks, and so forth. So those are a lot of decision makers that are, potentially going to be stewards of the land, going to plan for, for future generations to have those resources still available, but also are going to be making decisions about development and so forth. And so we try to work with those communities of people and decision makers. But it's a real challenge. So I always joke, this is my job security, that there's so many individual decision makers out there on the landscape. And from a biodiversity perspective, the watershed is one of the richest parts of New York State. We have tremendous biodiversity, and since I'm talking about amphibians tonight, I thought I would point out, of all of the amphibians that occur across the state of New York, 85% are right here in the Hudson Valley, in those 10 counties. So we really have a rich natural heritage here. Now, the blueprint for the work that we do with the Estuary program is outlined every 5 years in our Estuary Action Agenda, which is wrapping up next year. And I work under Goal 3, which is to conserve valley habitats and ecosystems, the rich diversity of plants and animals and habitats that are key to the vitality, natural beauty, and environmental quality of the Hudson River Valley. So, because you might ask yourself, what does a salamander have to do with a sturgeon, right? Like, why? We have an estuary program here. What are we doing out on the landscape with salamanders? Well, a lot of the salamanders that I'm going to be talking tonight, all the salamanders I'm going to be talking about tonight, live in forests and breed in wetlands. And forests and wetlands are two key important habitats in the watershed that help maintain clean water. They help us adapt to climate change. They really enable us to be a more resilient ecosystem and to be able to adapt to environmental change. And so I think of these guys as our little ambassadors of the watershed habitats or the watershed ecological communities that are so important to the health of the river. So 3 of our habitat conservation priorities within that goal that I work under are large forests. When you look at the Hudson Valley, driving along in a lot of places, it might feel like you're surrounded by forests, but thank you. If you take, that's really great. If you take, do you have a remote? No, I'm just kidding. A remote control too. So if you're driving around the Hudson Valley on a lot of roads, it probably looks like, we're surrounded by forests. But if you were to take an aerial view, you would see that a lot of our forests have been kind of fragmented through development of roads, things like that. And, if you've noticed, if you're not familiar, the town of Rhinebeck has these maps that are along the wall here, which are habitat maps that cover the entire town. And it really gives you a sense, because I'm certain that a lot of the green areas on these maps are your forested areas. And having tools like that can enable a town to think about, well, where are our large intact forests? And how can we work to plan for the future so that we're not chopping those forests up into smaller and smaller pieces? Because large forests function better than small fragments of forest. And small wetlands are another one of our conservation priorities. In the state of New York, wetlands that are over 5 hectares or 12.4 acres are protected by New York State. Anything smaller than that is not protected by New York State. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has regulations that don't protect isolated wetlands so much. So what ends up happening is a lot of our small isolated wetlands, like you see in this photo, are not protected by our federal and state regulations. And some communities have adopted their own wetland laws to try to protect these small habitats. But we're really, we're placing our concern here because these are two very vulnerable habitats that don't really have a lot of protection. And through proactive planning and through conservation work by land trusts and by communities, we can preserve these sorts of systems on the landscape. So the third priority there then is connectivity between habitats. Wildlife needs to move across the landscape, and when we create development patterns that fragment and separate habitats, we see a lot of mortality of animals, or we see habitat that doesn't function as well for breeding and so forth. So maintaining some kind of connectivity of natural habitats is really important, and that's our third priority, and it's really key to this amphibian conundrum I'll talk about tonight. Oh, so first, let's have let's just pause for a minute and think about roads, connectivity, and how we deal with it. Let's see here. Let me get it to start. There we go. So this was some sort of public service announcement from a French transportation authority. I don't speak French, but I got the point. And so in the absence of trampolines, what can we do, for wildlife and maintaining connectivity? And so our general model, the program that we deliver now at the Estuary program, is to provide tools like our habitat conservation framework for the Estuary program, which for the Estuary corridor, which outlines significant biodiversity areas throughout the valley and describes them and talks about the wildlife and habitats that are contained within them. We also have trainings for planning boards like you see here, and exercises to get people out in the field and identifying different habitats and so forth, and helping communities with mapping habitat like you see, like the Rhinebeck maps down here, and also holding roundtables and so forth, all with the intent to just raise the capacity for communities, help them understand what are the tools that you can use to identify what's important in your town, and then also to create plans and policies and procedures that will enable you to protect those places that your community has identified as important. But I've noticed, I've now been working in biodiversity outreach for 10 years, and I've noticed that oftentimes communities try to advance maybe some sort of progressive conservation action. It ends up polarizing the community. It creates a lot of challenges at the local level, and oftentimes we see these actions aren't sustainable with election cycles. They may change, and so I started thinking, well, we're working so much with local leaders, but how do we get people who are living in communities to understand why some of these actions are important? And so that's when I introduced these amphibian ambassadors, as I like to think of them, of our forests and wetlands and habitat connections. They're very charismatic, as you can see. And and if people could understand that these sorts of animals live in the woods and live in wetlands and breed in wetlands and move across the landscape, perhaps that would create a better understanding and support for local conservation actions. So let's talk about what is a woodland pool, because I'll get back to lots of photos of these guys in a little bit. What is a woodland pool, and what are the wildlife that migrate to woodland pools? So this is the kind of a classic textbook, little, small wetland in a depression that you would consider a woodland pool or a vernal pool. And I'm going to talk about the different terms in a couple slides. But there have also been called spring pools because they appear in the springtime. I refer to them as woodland pools, and again, I'll talk about why in a moment. Kind of more technical term, a seasonally ponded isolated wetland, that kind of spells it out. Down south, they refer to them as hog wallows in some places. And in Massachusetts, they call them wicked big puddles. And if you're walking along in the woods, that's kind of what they look like. They don't look like anything significant. You wouldn't think, oh, in just a matter of weeks, this wicked big puddle will be teeming with life, but it will be. Also, the underdogs of the wetland world, because they are so vulnerable and they're not really protected. And because they're not protected and because they dry up parts of the year, they're also can be called disappearing ponds. But what makes a woodland pool different from other wetland types? If you were to look at the habitat maps that Rhinebeck has up here, you'll see there's a whole suite of different kinds of wetlands: emergent marshes, hardwood swamps, kettle shrub pools, wet clay meadows. But what makes a woodland pool different, and what makes them the wetland of choice for breeding amphibians? Well, nature doesn't ever really cooperate with our black and white textbook definitions, but I'm going to try my best to just kind of characterize what makes them different from other wetlands. Just thinking about three components: where they are and what their surroundings are, the water kind of regime, and the wildlife that use or don't use woodland pools. So first, the setting. I always like to start out with this terminology, because everybody asks me, well, what's a vernal pool? How come you call them woodland pools? Vernal pools refer to seasonally flooded basins, kind of a depression in the ground, that are usually filled up in springtime. And I believe this term started in California, where there's been a lot of vernal pool conservation work that's happened over the years. But I like the term woodland pool because I'm narrowing it down to a type of vernal pool. This is a type of seasonally flooded basin, but it's in forested habitat. It's in woodland. And that's important because these amphibians that we're concerned about live in forests. So I'm eliminating the pools that occur out in meadows. Sometimes there's pools out in like coastal areas. But in the Northeast, this group of amphibians that are declining breed in pools that are in forests. And also, the term vernal pool would be a little bit of a misnomer, because here in New York and in the Northeast, we often see that these pools fill up in the fall as well, when we have autumn rain. And so the maximum depth for these temporary wetlands are actually achieved often in the spring and the fall. So really, it's just kind of a subset of vernal pool, and I'll probably use them both tonight. So they're usually very small, just under an acre is not uncommon, but 1 to 2 acres, and they're surrounded by forest. And that asterisk is just to remind me to talk about how important that is. So you have this depression that's filled, here we have probably late winter, and the previous fall, all the leaves in the ring of trees surrounding the pool have dropped into that pool. And they've created the basis for a pretty complex food chain that starts with a lot of aquatic invertebrates and fungi breaking down that leaf matter that makes it then available to developing breeding amphibians, which I'll talk about later. But we have all these tadpoles and salamander larvae then feeding on, some feeding on vegetative matter, some feeding on each other, some feeding on the aquatic invertebrates. And eventually they develop into adults, and they grow legs, and they move out of these pools, and they carry that basically food web energy that started in fallen leaves, and they carry that well out into the forest, where things like owls and hawks and turkey and snakes, may end up eating those salamanders. And so they become part of this complex forest web. So even though these wicked big puddles seem, kind of ordinary or uninteresting, there's actually a lot happening. And then there's other wildlife that will stop in and feed here. So it's a way of capturing the energy basically from fallen leaves and distributing it out into the forest through these little four-legged amphibians. It's pretty incredible. So that's why oftentimes people refer to woodland pools or vernal pools as the coral reefs of our northeastern forests, because they are just teeming with life, and they have such diversity and so much, so many natural processes happening there. Okay, so that's the setting. They're surrounded by forest, they're small depression. That small depression in the land relates a lot to what we see in terms of water characteristics. So they typically have no inlet or outlet. There's not a perennial stream flowing, keeping it filled with water. It's usually isolated. And in fact, this group here, this was down in the Hudson Highlands, this group was working on, they were volunteers working on a habitat map, much like the Rhinebeck maps, but as a volunteer group. And we were all in a depression of a woodland pool that was dry during the summertime. And it would be hard to notice, if you didn't poke around and dig up the leaves and see that the soil was dark underneath. Maybe there were some fingernail clam shells, maybe some vegetation that's used to more, soggy soils. But in any case, so they're shallow, and the water depth usually isn't much more than a meter of water, about 3 feet. And because there's no permanent stream, or there's no inlet or outlet, they're holding water, but they're not, they're subject to drying. And so what they go through is this wet, dry cycle, where you get snowmelt and rainfall in the spring, and in some places, you know, you'll even have groundwater coming up, filling that pool in the springtime. But usually, come summer, it's dried up already. And then, like I mentioned before, it may fill again in the fall from a rising water table or from rain. And so basically, it creates this temporary abundance of water. And these amphibians have adapted and evolved to take advantage of this temporary abundance of water. Because, well, first let me show you this. This is, these are images from vernalpool.org. If anybody's interested in learning more or getting slides or images or different resources, vernalpool.org is a Massachusetts-based organization that has a lot of great information. And actually, the University of Maine also has a lot of good woodland pool, vernal pool information. But these images came from that site, and this is the same pool through different times of year, and it gives you that idea of how full they are in late winter, early spring. They start to shrink, you know, the water levels start to drop later spring, and by summer, they're often dry. And of course, this varies. You know, you might have pools that are relatively full, and maybe they only dry up every few years. You'll have some that, you know, dry up every year. It just depends on the individual pool. So now I want to talk about the wildlife. So if you have a pool that doesn't have a stream flowing in, and it dries up at least, you know, probably once a year, once every so years, what wildlife is missing? And for those of you who've heard this talk before, don't answer if you've heard me give this talk before, but what wildlife would be missing if this pool is drying up? What's that? Yes, exactly. So that's a huge piece of this puzzle. Woodland pools don't support fish populations, so there's no predators there to feed on all these yummy morsels of egg masses and salamander larvae. And so it creates this perfect breeding ground or nursery for these developing salamander larvae and frog and toad tadpoles. But it's basically a race against dryness because they need to go through this whole process of courtship, you know, showing up in the pool, doing a little courtship ritual. You know, the females lay their eggs. The adults all leave. They're only there for maybe a week or two, if that. And then their eggs are left in these egg masses, which are, you know, about a fist-sized clump of eggs that are then going to be there for a while until they develop, and then they hatch, and eventually you'll have, you know, little salamander larvae or frog tadpoles, and they need to grow and then eventually grow legs and get out before it dries up. So it's a race against dryness. So as a result of that race to get in there and have all this happen before the pool dries up, they need to get in there early. And that's part of the big night phenomenon I'm going to talk about. So just keep that in mind, the race against dryness. And just to tell you what these photos are, here's an adult spotted salamander that was out 2 years ago in New Paltz. We were out during a big migration night, and there was still snow on the ground along the edges of the road. It moved right through the snow. But these are some of the telltale signs of breeding in a woodland pool. These are spermatophores, which are these little packets of sperm that the males deposit on the bottom of the pool. And it'll almost look like breadcrumbs have been kind of tossed at the bottom of the pool. And the females actually will then come and pick up those sperm packets and eventually then lay their, you know, deposit these egg masses. And there's usually groups of them, and the spotted salamander, sometimes egg masses are cloudy white, sometimes they're clear. And when they emerge, the salamander larvae have these external gills. So they have these kind of like a fringe-looking headdress around their neck, as opposed to tadpoles of frogs, which have internal gills, and you won't see that. So even though salamander larvae are difficult to identify, unless you're kind of a skilled, you know, amphibian or herpetologist or taxonomist, you could at least kind of note the difference between frog and salamander larvae based on the presence of those external gills. Oh, and the other thing to point out is that because there's all this biomass, all this, you know, these egg masses, and then, you know, thousands of salamander larvae and tadpoles of frogs, it's great foraging habitat for a variety of other species. You know, Dutchess County, Rhinebeck, you've got Blanding's turtle. The timing of Blanding's turtle, you know, Blanding's turtle females are out usually nesting around Memorial Day weekend, I would say. And so you figure a few weeks before that, the females are starting to move and get, you know, closer to their breeding or their nesting upland nesting grounds, so they're leaving their wetlands, their core wetlands, their safe shelter where they live. They're starting to move across a landscape to get to upland nesting grounds. They'll stop over at a vernal pool, and I always joke, it's like you know, what, like a Super 8 motel, or, you know, it's like a place where they can take refuge underwater. They can be, you know, safe from predators that might be moving about on the landscape. And they also have a great buffet of high protein, you know, amphibians to eat. And same thing with spotted turtles. A lot of spotted turtles will feed in these pools, you know, herons. Ribbon snakes, I believe, have been documented feeding in vernal pools. So they really, again, like I mentioned, are a key part of the forest food web. So just to kind of wrap up that, you know, we've been working on this definition. I like this definition from the state of Maine, that woodland pools are naturally occurring, seasonal bodies of water that are free of predatory fish populations and provide breeding habitat for indicator species. You know, when we try to define a habitat, there's different reasons to do so. It might be for a local wetland law. It might be for creating a certification program. It might be for a citizen science program. So, but I feel like this really captures it well. And that idea of indicator species I'll talk about next. So, what amphibians use woodland pools? A lot of times you'll hear the term obligate species, and that's kind of implying that by necessity, this species needs to use this habitat type. They're an obligate woodland pool breeder. You'll hear that term. Or they're an indicator species, meaning they're a good indicator of woodland pools. And basically that's suggesting that this group of mole salamanders, which is this group of species that actually spend most of their time underground. They use a lot of small mammal burrows. So it's not like you could go walking around in the forest during the day and expect to see beautiful yellow polka dotted 7-inch long salamanders. They're generally nocturnal. They come out when it's moist, but they do a lot of, they spend a lot of their time underground. And so that's why they refer to this group of salamanders as mole salamanders, not to be confused with the species, the mole salamander. But so if, you know, but by being obligate, say vernal pool breeders, along with wood frogs, it's to say like, oh, okay, wood frog, I'm giving you an option of breeding under these cattails in this beautiful marsh, or under this thick tree canopy in this woodland, or in this hardwood swamp, or in this nice open woodland pool that's fringed with trees. That's, you know, by necessity, they're going to want to breed in the woodland pool where there's sunlight getting through, so that the water is warm enough that, you know, the eggs can develop, there's no fish, and so forth. So there's a number of characteristics that I just talked about that make the pools the perfect breeding for these species. Now, not to say you won't get other species breeding in woodland pools, but for this group, that's really their preferred habitat for breeding, and that's where they're most successful. So let's talk about each of these species. Here we have the wood frog. How many of you see or hear wood frogs? Okay, a few. Well, here, I'm going to play you the wood frogs, because I bet you'll realize that you've heard them.
Wood frog, Rana sylvatica.
Let me see if I can... Where do they start getting going? All right. So great. I mean, I think, you know, so many people think of the robin being the sign of spring. I feel like hearing that gets me excited that spring is here. And those are the males calling out to females. And I'm always amazed that if you hear them and you start to, you know, go toward the pool to see them, they just quiet down when you arrive at the pool. You know, just amazing. But so wood frogs, they live out in the forest. And as you can see, so this map in the lower left is the results of the New York State Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, which was conducted between 1990 and 2007. And this basically broke up the state into census blocks where volunteers and biologists would document species observed in that census block. And so if you're interested in this, it's all on the DEC website. But you can see, based on all the census blocks that are yellow, wood frogs are pretty widely distributed. And I was amazed when I was in Alaska a few years ago at a wetland, walking along the boardwalk and reading all the signs they had, the interpretive signs about nature there. There was a whole sign about wood frogs and their life cycle. They're so widespread. They're really a very well-adapted, resilient little animal. But you know, and you can identify them by this mask. It's kind of the dark mask, like the Zorro mask. If you're looking straight at them, it looks like. They have these dorsal ridges. But generally, you know, they're variable in color. Sometimes they look a little bit more tan, and this one's a little bit more orange. And, you know, about the size, like when they're large and a female is full of eggs, about this, you know, sit in your palm of your hand. They're much smaller than like a bullfrog, for example. They're only maybe, you know, 2 inches. But often, you know, very, very frequently seen during the migration crossings that I'll talk about. Now, and they're, you know, they're a great indicator of woodland pools. They're one of the kind of obligate species. And these are not dark spots. This is some leaf litter that it's carrying along on its back from when it was in the water, I guess. Now, here's a spotted salamander. And out of all of those mole salamanders, in New York State, this is the most common, I would say. And this little guy we found down at Norrie Point. We rolled over a log, and this little juvenile, which was very tiny, you can see my friend's ring here, so it's a very small little spotted salamander. But the adults are, you know, a good 7, 8 inches. They're a large salamander. It's almost like an annual surprise to me when I remember how big they are. You know, when I'm out there during a migration, and it's just an impressive animal and beautiful with these, you know, yellow spots. Every individual has its own spot pattern, and they live out in the forest like the wood frog and only move to breed in woodland pools in late winter, early spring, and then move back out into the forest after breeding season. Now, another one of our mole salamanders, which is a little bit more complicated, is the Jefferson blue-spotted salamander complex, we call it. So we have the Jefferson salamander here, which is generally kind of a drab brown. This was one I found at Mohonk Preserve, and if you could see closely, you'd see there's a little bit of light blue flecking along its sides. But it's a pretty, it's not as long usually as spotted salamander, but it's comparable in size, and it's pretty girthy. You can see it's got a pretty broad head. And a little bit more petite, but also fairly long, is the blue-spotted salamander. And in much of their range here in the Northeast, well, in New York in particular, there have been interbreeding, and if it's very difficult, even for trained, you know, seasoned herpetologists to identify whether you're looking at a pure Jeff salamander or pure blue spotted. I mean, here's a great example. This is one that definitely shows characteristics of both. You've got the brown body, you've got the blue flecking of the blue spotted salamander. And these maps show that, you know, this is the Jeff salamander complex, this is the blue spotted salamander complex. There's blue, I can't actually read it, the blue dots indicate, in this case, where the Jeff salamanders, where they had known pure Jeffs, and the blue dots on this map show where they had blue spotted pure salamanders, and the yellow squares are the same on both, showing where they had the complex. And you'll see that, I mean, the main point here is in the Hudson Valley, especially too, you know, they're not widely distributed like the spotted and the wood frog. And so for our volunteers that get involved in this project, we don't ask for, you know, distinguishing between those two. We just ask for, you know, them to refer to them as Jeff Blue Spotted Salamander Complex. Now, look at this guy. How cute. I know, how cute. I can never get over that photo. So plump. So this is the marbled salamander, and you probably won't see marbled salamanders. Just a few rare volunteers have seen one during the spring, because these guys actually breed in the fall. But I had to mention them because their life history is so interesting. The females actually go to the pools, and the males, and she eventually, you know, lays her eggs in a dry pool bed, usually kind of at the margins of the pool. And she guards them until the fall rains inundate the pool. And after a certain, you know, short period of time, she'll leave them after they've been inundated, and they actually will hatch, and the larvae live under the ice. And so a lot of times people will tell me, oh, I've gone out to see a pool, like first thing in the spring, and there's already salamander larvae. And that's, you know, generally that will be marbled salamander larvae, because they get a head start. So they also get a leg up, or a fin up, on the salamander larvae from the other species that are going to be a lot smaller than them. And so they can kind of exploit different food, resources that the smaller youngsters, can't eat necessarily. So it's a neat life history. It's also a little risky because say she lays her eggs too high up on the edge of the pool, they might not get inundated. Say she lays them too low in the pool, it might just be a quick rain event, they get inundated, and then the pool dries up and now those eggs won't develop. So, there's trade-offs, with all adaptation. The other point here I wanted to make is that you'll see marbled salamander distribution is limited in New York State, and we're actually at the northern edge of their range. So perhaps with climate change and warming temperatures, we may see that change. And that's why, any sorts of projects where we have volunteers with more eyes and boots on the ground to help us know where these species are seen is helpful. And in fact, I've already learned that Columbia County, I gave this talk there last year, and there was a couple that's been documenting marbled salamander up in Columbia County. So that's actually this atlas map, which is 6 years old now, is outdated. How big do they get? Oh, they're probably about 4 or 5 inches. Okay, so this is not a obligate woodland pool breeding species, but I also wanted to talk about, I could talk all night just about amphibians, but I have to talk about other things too. So I'm going to end with this guy, but what I found is a lot of people don't actually realize that these are the same species. And so I like to take this opportunity to clarify. The eastern or red-spotted newt has a juvenile terrestrial phase that we all call, that we know as the newt when we're walking out in the woods and it's moist out. You'll often see these guys, beautiful bright orange newt walking across the forest floor. But as adults, and it could be up to 7 years that they are in this terrestrial form, their bodies start to morph. And I found this one up in the Catskills that I thought was a really neat kind of transitional phase. You can see how the tail has keeled compared to the round tail of the juvenile, and its toes have gotten longer and a little bit more webbed. And so this is transforming into the adult aquatic version. And these guys will be seen sometimes during spring migrations. They'll also sometimes be seen, actually frequently breeding in woodland pools, but they're also seen in permanent water bodies like lakes and ponds. So they're more what we call a facultative species, where woodland pools are an option for them, but they also can breed pretty successfully in other places as well. So yeah, so these are all red-spotted newts, but this red eft is the juvenile phase, and this is the aquatic adult phase here. Okay, so I feel like I have to deliver the answer to this question because that was what was on the flyer. And why did the salamander cross the road? Well, it has a lot to do with the way we've planned our communities. And getting back to that idea of connectivity, well, there's lots of these amphibians living out in the forest that maybe have great connectivity to a woodland pool, and they move across the forest floor when they migrate without us ever even knowing that it's happening, and they get to the pool no problem. But there's also communities where we have roads and developments between these two habitat types, and these species will they actually return to their natal pool, so they return to the pool that they emerged from. So if they are continuing this effort and suddenly there's a road in the way, they'll cross that road. And as you can imagine, that's, they're vulnerable to predators, they're vulnerable to desiccation if it's not, rainy enough, but you'll see that they really move on wet nights. And they are really vulnerable to mortality from vehicles. To give you a sense, these are some migration distances that have been documented and were summarized in this great vernal pool book by Elizabeth Coburn that came out in 2004. And wood frogs have been recorded traveling in distances like 1,000 to over 2,000 feet. So we're talking almost half a mile. And that's basically from where they are out in the forest, the 11 and a half months out of the year when they move into woodland pools for breeding. And, similarly impressive, distances for Jefferson and blue-spotted salamander. But really for all of these, if you can imagine you're a 7-inch salamander and you're trying to travel, even 500 feet in the Hudson Valley, chances are you're going to bump into some sort of barrier, like a curb, a storm drain, a road, and so forth. So it's, as my graduate school professor coined the term, a landscape of fear, perhaps, for these guys as they move across. And here's a very cartoony representation of this event. So you have these salamanders moving in the late winter, early spring. You know, it's leaf off season. There's generally no leaves on the trees. And they're all moving from wherever they live out in the forest the rest of the year into these pools by the hundreds, if not thousands, depending on the size of the pool and the location. So when does it happen? It's usually when it's been rainy most of the day, because literally like today, if it was 10 degrees warmer and it was, you know, late March, it would have been, I would have felt like I should be stopping on the road to check. The ground has to be thawed, because remember, a lot of these guys are hunkered down in the ground for the winter. So we want the ground to have thawed. And evening temperatures in the 40s. That's generally the kind of rule of thumb. Of course, there's always a little bit of variability, but generally that's what we see happening. And it's referred to by a lot of amphibian enthusiasts as the big night, meaning, remember getting back to that idea of this race against dryness? They need to get in that pool and do their thing and get those eggs underwater as quickly as they can if their young are going to survive and get out before the pool dries up. So really, I always imagine, like, you know, when we get to that time in March when the temperatures are hovering in the late, you know, at night 35, it's, you know, we're getting rain. I just imagine they're all like ready to go. They're ready to go, waiting for it just to be a little bit warmer, a little bit, you know, a little rainier, because like last year, for those of you who volunteered, it was a really tricky year because we weren't getting the rain. We were getting warm temperatures, and in the spring it was really dry, and we had much less documented and fewer volunteers last year, in part because it was very difficult to predict. It was just a bizarre year, and that's nature. That's what's beautiful about nature. It's full of surprises. But in any case, so that big night term, I have it in quotes because some people don't actually like to use that term, because, you know, sometimes if all the conditions line up right, you will get a big, massive migration on one particular or two particular nights. But oftentimes you get medium-sized, you know, migrations over the course of, you know, several. And also, you know, you get Jefferson salamanders move to the pools earliest, and they'll actually even go when there's ice still on the pools, and they'll sneak in, you know, if there's an opening where they can get into the water. And, you know, and also later in the spring, you know, a couple of weeks after that big night, you'll get a lot of salamanders, if it's been dry for a while, they haven't had a lot of opportunity to move when it's wet, when, you know, when they can keep their skin moist. They may all end up moving, you know, you might see them moving back then to the forest. That doesn't have to be timed as strategically, obviously, as getting to the pool. So I don't think we see the big explosive kind of migrations back to the woods that we see heading to the pools. So just to give you an idea, and this actually, yeah.
The rain is to keep them moist.
Right, I mean, because they're, you know, they breathe, you know, through their skin, quote unquote, and so it's really important for them to stay moist, and that's why, again, like I said, you know, on all those dry nights last year, we just weren't really seeing anything, even though it seemed like the conditions were right, and we knew that they were probably really anxious to get to the pools to breed. And I think some just went undetected. Some went, maybe if there was like a little bit of rain at 3 in the morning, they took advantage and they moved, you know, but we weren't out the way we normally would be on those days where it's raining all day and you just know come darkness, you want to get out and look. So just to give you some results, which are summarized in a handout that is on the table when you walked in, which was, I still haven't gotten through all the 2012 data, but volunteers of the project over the course of those 3 years counted 20 species and over 7,000 individuals. And so you hear, you know, we have the different species here. These are salamanders on the left, frogs and toads on the right. Total live, total dead. And so the biggest numbers were for spotted salamander, where we had over 2,000 documented live, you know, sadly over 600 dead. A lot of spring peepers, and as somebody just told me today, they love this because they love getting out and seeing peepers, because usually you just hear peepers and you can't find where the peeper is, you know, when you try to track it when it's calling. But during the road crossing, I mean during the migration, if you're out on a road and they're crossing there, you'll see lots of peepers. Most volunteers usually end up writing, you know, more than I can count, because there's just, the peepers are so tiny, and if it's raining and you're trying to count all these salamanders, the peepers are hard to keep track of. But you'll see there's been a little, you know, there's been 1 or 2 here of different species, but it's been a really great opportunity for volunteers to get to see these amphibians, which otherwise are pretty elusive and difficult to find during the rest of the year. All right, so why is all this important? Because that's really, you know, if you're going to leave here and talk to your neighbors or talk to your planning board or talk to your, you know, your land trust or whomever, it's important to kind of understand why is this important, and to help compel people to appreciate that this is a system that's worth preserving. So why is this important and why should we care? So based on different studies, the Hudson Valley and southern Catskills are really considered hotspots for salamander diversity. And as I mentioned earlier, woodland pools are among the most critical but least protected wetland habitats. Larger wetlands, as I mentioned, fall within the regulations of New York State to be protected, but smaller, in particular isolated wetlands, don't have protection. And the other piece of this is forests, right? So these species live in forests and they just breed in woodland pools. And what I've seen often are communities that are interested in preserving woodland pools do so, but with a very small forested buffer or small protected upland area around it. And that's great for the 2 weeks out of the year that these animals are breeding, but it doesn't really protect where they're living the whole rest of the year, which, as I showed you in that table of distances, they're really living in forest far away from the pools. Why else is it important? Amphibians can serve as indicators of ecological health. These are animals that are living both in the upland area, the terrestrial area, as well as in these aquatic habitats. And if they're doing well, the systems are doing well. And what's good for nature and good for these animals is good for us. And so we all benefit from having healthy forests and wetlands. So I feel like if we can find good, healthy populations of these species, it suggests to us that we probably have ample forests for filtering our groundwater. We have wetlands for holding floodwater and so forth. So, and those two examples I just gave are what we call ecosystem services, community benefits we receive from different systems. And this is a common sight when we don't have enough potential to naturally hold our floodwater. We see road closures from flooding more and more. So I always like to point out that wetlands are really important for building our capacity to hold floodwater. The EPA has estimated that 1 acre of wetland can hold 1 to 1.5 million gallons of floodwater. That's imagining like 3 feet deep of water, which is about a meter, which is about a vernal pool. And so while it may seem impressive, and it is impressive if you have a 100-acre wetland, that's a massive amount of water it holds. But these other researchers have suggested that the cumulative loss of small wetlands may also have profound regional impacts. A single quarter-acre wetland may not seem significant to lose, on the landscape, but if you lost 1,000 small wetlands, that would be a different story and could contribute to things like off-site flooding. So, this is a seed I like to plant in the minds of folks who are making decisions about stewardship and planning and so forth, that even these small wetlands, which may seem insignificant, cumulatively, contribute to not only wildlife and habitat, but also to community benefits like floodwater control. And why is this important? The forests that these animals live in are also important, and forests support human health in a variety of ways. They help adapt, help us adapt to warming temperatures. They filter groundwater and so forth. But I'm sure many of you have heard the studies that have been done right, I guess pretty much southeast of here at Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, where they looked at fragmentation of forest and where they found patches of forest that had been fragmented down to smaller than 5 acres. So meaning that, the area around it has been cleared or fragmented by roads or long driveways and so forth. They actually found that those smaller forest patches couldn't support a diversity of small mammals. But this guy here, the white-footed mouse, flourished. This is what we call like an opportunistic or generalist species. It didn't mind that it was living in a small forest. The voles and the chipmunks and other species, they didn't like it so much, they moved out, enabling this guy here to flourish. And this is the primary carrier of Lyme. And so they actually found that there was higher risk of Lyme disease in these small forest patches. So again, large forests, great for amphibians, also great for us. And it's something that as landowners and community members and planning boards and environmental commissions and land trusts, it's something we can think about as we set conservation and planning goals. Why else is this important? Well, these poor amphibians are faced with many challenges. This was a Scientific American headline in 2008. A world without frogs, combined threats may croak amphibians. From climate change to herbicide pollution, it's not easy being an amphibian. And so they attributed global declines of amphibians to a variety of factors, everything from pollutants and climate change to things like habitat loss and fragmentation and road mortality during migrations. And when I think about, well, what's my sphere of influence at the Hudson River Estuary program? Let's say I work with communities on habitat protection, and I know we have a social capital in the Hudson Valley of people who are so interested in conservation that these 3 bullets here are the ones that we probably could try to address. And habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, you know, we work on those problems through some of the technical assistance and trainings for planning boards and so forth. But this road mortality is a great way to engage citizen volunteers. Why else is this important? I don't know if you're aware, but there's actually a, you know, there's poaching, smuggling, and illegal sale of reptiles and amphibians, even here in New York. You know, somebody who doesn't have a beautiful spotted salamander in their neck of the woods might find it a really fabulous pet if they're interested in, you know, charismatic, unique pets. And so if you're interested, this is from the DEC website. There was an article written in 2009 about this huge bust that our undercover environmental conservation officers, you know, accomplished, where, and it was called Operation Shell Shock, where they actually found, it says here, more than 2,400 turtles, snakes, and salamanders involved in crimes. So we also have to be careful about, you know, just keeping our eyes out for anything that looks a little shady. And also, when we know about really healthy populations of animals, you know, we want to use that information for planning and so forth, but we also want to maybe not put it out on the World Wide Web, because somebody who has, you know, not such great intentions might be interested in knowing exactly where they can go, you know, collect 500 spotted salamanders. So just something else to keep in mind, and why this is important, because this is one more threat to these species here in New York. All right, so how can you help? Well, for starters, I know I've mentioned this a lot, but just help to conserve these conservation priorities. Like I said, whether you're a landowner and stewarding your own land, or you're volunteering with a land trust, or on your community boards and commissions, learn where these places are and think about how are they discussed in things like your comprehensive plan. You know, does your town have an open space plan that enables proactive conservation of these places? Because you know what ends up happening a lot is we fight to protect these resources very late in the game. For example, maybe during the seeker process at a local planning board meeting, when at that point the applicants invested a lot of money and they're not really excited to find out late in the game that there's this fabulous vernal pool and this wonderful forest. But if the planning board knew in advance that they could say, you know what, we know we've got this great resource and we would love if you could try to adjust the development so that we can preserve this area. It's a win-win for the community and the, you know, the economic growth that needs to happen as well. So having information like the town of Rhinebeck has up here really helps inform and enables proactive planning. Because this is the kind of the general understanding or the best management or development practices for woodland pools. This was a document that came out over 10 years now, 10 years ago, conserving pool breeding amphibians in residential and commercial development in the northeastern U.S. And basically what it suggested is if you have a vernal pool, 100 feet from that pool, there should be no development. So if you're making a planning decision on your land or for a town, you really should preserve that's kind of a critical area, because what happens is a lot of males will even kind of start to congregate there closer to breeding time. A lot of the juveniles that leave may spend their first couple of years in that critical area. So it's kind of it's an important spot near, or, you know, near and around that pool. And it's also really important because, again, that forested area around that pool feeds the food web. That area now from 100 feet out from the pool to 750 feet out from the pool is considered the important terrestrial habitat, but it can withstand about 25% development. So within that buffer, that forested buffer area around a pool, that adjacent forested area can withstand about 25% of that area being developed. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to all happen in one little slice of the pie here, but you know, scattered out within there, the animals could probably survive with some development there. So this was the understanding 11 years ago. Of course, we're always trying to improve our science and improve our understanding, and this sort of approach fits well into the way we often plan and design conservation and development actions. But more recently, a few years ago, Aram Calhoun has been doing a tremendous amount of great vernal pool work up in University of Maine and in the state of Maine. And she's thinking now about directional buffer guidelines, which is going to take a little bit more understanding of the landscape. And again, having habitat maps is a great start. Also doing site visits. But it's looking at, instead of saying, okay, we've got 250, or I think in this case, this is a 250-foot circular buffer, which is the requirement in the state of Maine. They're looking at, well, let's see, in that 250-foot buffer, you're not going to have spotted salamanders and wood frogs out in these mowed fields and in this big lake. they're going to be using upland forest, and this is swamp area here. So instead, I don't know exactly how this line got drawn in this example, but instead they're suggesting, well, maybe we need to think about a buffer that actually has the kind of habitat that they need, that these species need, and think about protecting that. And so it's an emerging science, and it's something that we'll learn more about. But just, again, you know, things that need to be considered if we're trying to conserve these species. And so how else can you help? How can you hop if you're a frog? Is the Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings Project. So I'll take a few minutes now to talk about the project and how you can get involved. And these are all really happy volunteers. And this group actually was out in Tivoli, I think Tivoli in Rhinebeck just a few years ago, getting soaked in the rain. So the goals that, of this project were, you know, I have a number of actual objectives, but one is to, you know, identify where there's high-risk crossings. If the Department of Transportation said, we just got this $100 million grant and we want to install culverts to help conserve salamanders that are migrating, where should we put them? We don't know. You know, it's not like the DEC has scientists out every night of a migration throughout the entire state of New York figuring this out. That's the problem. It's happening all over the place on only a couple of nights. So having volunteers help identify these places will enable us to one day have hopefully a good solid set of information that we can use not only to inform state agencies but also local land use planning and local conservation efforts. You know, I think it's the Mohawk, what is it? The land, Lucy, you might know, what's the Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy that's up in Albany County, do you know? No. Well, they actually knew of a big migration that's got a lot of diversity, and they ended up getting a conservation easement for some lands near that pool and that crossing so that they could try to keep that, those habitats that they're using intact. Also, it'll be interesting, you know, not after, this is the 5th year of the project, but not after 5 years, but you know, if this project could continue for many years into the future, we might be able to see changes from, you know, that maybe are related to climate change, different kinds of rainfall patterns in the spring, you know, earlier migration times. But also, I just wanted to provide a rewarding volunteer experience. It's pretty, I mean, yes, it's devastating when you see dead animals on the road, but it's also pretty satisfying to know that you're helping these amphibians move to safety. If you pick them up and move them across the road and you know that they've now hopefully escaped the tires of a car. And also just to get to see these species and, you know, and learn about them is I like to think is rewarding. And again, that idea that I was hoping if more and more people became aware of these animals and the habitats they use, it would create support for local conservation actions. And then finally, just to educate. I mean, one of my favorite moments of the 4 years I've been going out, and longer actually, looking at these amphibians, there's one spot I always go in New Paltz, and one year, we were out, you know, we've got our headlamps on and the high beams on the car and probably the hazards flashing and orange vests, and we look a little crazy. And some neighbor at the bottom of his slope, so his yard basically like sloped down from the road. He was at the bottom and he's like, "What are you doing up there?" You know, and we're helping salamanders, right? So I had to go get him. He put on his raincoat, he came up, and he got to see a spotted salamander, and he was so thrilled. He said, "I've lived here 20 years. I never knew this was happening." And at the end of his road is a beautiful vernal pool, and that's where we go every year, and we count hundreds of animals moving. So hopefully now that person, you know, will go out, and he'll care. And, you know, another night we were out, and two like 18-year-old high school guys pulled over because they thought we were having car problems and wanted to help. And I gave them our, you know, our fact sheet and our flyer, and they were so excited. So it's just a great opportunity to educate other people, and maybe that will lead to supportive conservation work. So ways to learn about the project. We do have a website, and I want to warn everybody now that I don't have the new data form for this year up yet, but it has lots of information. It has links to different identification guides. And if that is too long of a website to write down, if you just go to the DEC website, or even if you just go to Google and type in Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings Project, it'll usually go right to our website. And if not, the flyer that I had at the table with the 3-year summary also has the website. And also, if you signed in tonight, I'll add you to this email alert list. And this is really how I stay in touch with volunteers, because I can't go out and work with volunteers, so they're all over the place. So literally, I think we've had participation in 9 counties. But what I will do is when the temperature conditions start looking right, I'll send out blasts of emails to everybody saying, you know, it's looking like a promising night on Wednesday, keep your schedule open, and so forth. Although, to be honest, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. I don't send out a ton of emails. It's really just during the spring, so you're not going to get spammed all year long. And I also will send out announcements about other wetland-related opportunities in programs if you're interested, other amphibian-related resources. So ways that you can help. I often get asked, well, where can I go? Again, it goes back to the original question, where can you go? We don't know exactly. So one thing you could do is just be a crossing scout. Grab a friend, go in your car, and, you know, especially for those of you who do live in Rhinebeck or some of the other surrounding towns and Dutchess have habitat maps, look for roads that go through forested areas where there's wetlands, and, you know, just drive really slowly and kind of look through your windshield, and you'll kind of eventually get used to the signature on the road of this, you know, this animal that's this big. You know, once you start kind of getting a search image for that, you'll get a sense of what you're looking for, or you'll see the frogs hopping slowly across the road, and start marking on a map. You know, maybe decide where you're going, bring your atlas or a photocopy of the map, and indicate, you know, where you are and the kinds of stuff you're seeing, or that you're just seeing activity at all, and it might be a good place to visit in the future. Or you can get out of your car and be what we call a crossing guard and just help the animals move across the road. Or you can go so far as to bring your data form out, which we really appreciate, and actually documenting where you were and the species and so forth, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the key is to clear your spring schedule and be prepared for spontaneity. Just kidding, but not really, because that's the other thing that makes this project really hard. I can't say, okay, everybody, on March 20th, we're going to all meet up and we're going to go out and look for amphibians. It really doesn't happen that way. So if you want to get out, you have to be spontaneous. I've had volunteers send me stuff where they were out 2 in the mornings. They were driving home from somewhere and they happened to see stuff and they pulled over and facilitated a crossing. So it requires a little bit of spontaneity, which is why I value our volunteers so much, because not only are they going out on an unscheduled basis, they're going out in 40-degree weather, in the rain, in the dark. It's not, you know, it's like today, only 8 degrees warmer. It's not that fun unless you get to see amphibians, which is very exciting. Number one, you know, we care about the safety of these animals, but your safety comes first. My colleague Joe here is doing the right thing. He's got his vest and a headlamp. You know, wear a blinking light. Do something to make yourself stand out, because, you know, I know for myself, driving in the dark and when it's rainy and there's reflections, it's not that easy to see. So you want to be seen. You want to be prepared to be cold, so dress warmly and dress so that you can be out in the rain for a while. And one thing we request quite seriously is don't interfere with traffic or flag down anybody. Your role is not to be out there stopping traffic and educating every driver that goes by, because, you know, some people aren't going to be as excited about the project as you are. One thing I do suggest is we have a fact sheet on our website that you can print out, or if you don't have a printer, you can email me and I'll mail you copies. Bring them in your car, and this way if a landowner or a passerby says, what are you doing? You can just give them that and say, you know, and if in the event a police officer stops to ask what you're doing, you can also show them that. So what to bring, like I said, lots of, you know, lanterns, things to see. We've found that these big lanterns, it's called a Rayovac workhorse, really projects a big beam of light that enables you to see much better than bringing a small flashlight. You know, things like data forms, scrap paper, clipboard, pencils, identification guides, which can be printed from our website, but also I can provide if you need. If you have a group that's going out, I'm happy to share. We have on loan. I can loan out for the season some some orange vests, some ID guides, and so forth. So if you think you want to organize a group of volunteers, maybe through your environmental commission, your land trust, whoever, let me know, and I'd be happy to share those materials. Sadly, a spatula for removing dead animals off the road so they don't get counted twice if you have a group, because I know for me, I go back and forth a lot on the same road. Some people prefer to put the animals in some kind of container to move them across the road, but you want it to be clean. Any physical contact with the amphibians exposes them to whatever is on your hands, because they do, you know, everything goes right through their skin. So you don't want to, you know, just lather up with hand sanitizer or bug repellent or something like that and then go pick up a salamander. You want your hands to be extremely clean, and moist is good too, but if you're out in the rain, generally that's taken care of. And if you bring out a camera, make sure it's also prepared for rain. But we love pictures. I mean, this kind of picture, I ask my volunteers all the time, send me pictures of you. I have so many pictures of amphibians. I want pictures of you out there with the amphibians. But also, the cameras are great if you take pictures of species you can't identify and email them to me. I'll try to help identify them. If you're doing that, it's helpful to have a couple different angles, just to note that. And so, okay, you've arrived. What do? If you've been driving along, you see some activity. So park in a safe place, and literally this is what it's going to look like. It's pretty. There's not a lot of opportunity to see besides whatever you bring with you to illuminate the area. Last year, I held 2 trainings for this project, and we did a mock crossing where we had cutouts of all different laminated amphibians on the ground, and we turned out the lights in the room. We didn't have any rain to simulate rain, but the volunteers just had lights, and they said, "This is hard, we can't see." I said, "Yeah, imagine it's raining and it's cold and you're outside, and so that's what it's going to be like." And so it's really good to have some kind of really good way to see, a lantern or something. But keep an eye underfoot, because literally if they're out there, especially along the shoulders of the road where it might be grassy, it's really difficult to see. So we always say keep your feet on the street, try to keep your feet on pavement where you can actually see a lot better, because you'll easily step on stuff if it's in the grass. Okay, now what happens? You found one, it's alive, what do? Again, make sure your hands are clean, and see what they're doing really carefully, kind of cupping the animal so that if you're going to pick it up and help it move across the road, you're not dropping it from 2 meters up in the air, or 3 feet up in the air, and gently pick it up and move it in the direction it was heading. Don't assume you know better where the animal's going. They know what they're doing. So even if they see there's a couple of species going, or a couple of individuals going opposite direction than everybody else, that's okay. Just move them in the direction they were going, because they may have already been to the pool, done their business, and are now heading back to the forest. And if you're recording species, then that's great, and I'll show you the data form in a minute. Now, sadly, you have to be prepared, because you will see a lot of carnage on the road, a lot, and it's very sad. And so if you find one that's dead, we want you to still record that on the data form, and then use a spatula at your hands to take it off the road, so that if you are going to be repeating this stretch of road back and forth, you don't count that individual twice. So collecting data. Well, Kaisa and her dad did a great job here. They actually got everything, almost. They got the date, they got the location, the time they were out, the temperature, the weather, and what they saw. And one of my sad but favorite parts of this is 4 dead frogs laying in the middle of the road. I mean, it's very sad, but what else would they be doing in the road if they were dead in the road? But in any case, it's, as you can see, I mean, the kinds of information we're looking for, it's pretty straightforward. I tried to keep it as simple as possible, because I know that it's, you're out in the rain at night in the cold. So here's the actual data form, and this is right now on the website. It's the 2012 data form. It's probably going to be pretty similar. And one important reminder is please use a separate data form for every road crossing, because it just makes life a lot easier when I have a stack of like 100 of these and I'm entering them all into the database, and I'm not trying to figure out which road you're talking about, if you have multiple roads on the same sheet. But basically, you're talking about weather, what the weather was in the last 24 hours, weather conditions, so the last 24 hours, traffic during the migration. So basically, if you were there for 20 minutes, how many cars, went by, or if you're there for an hour, just use a 20-minute sample to count how many cars were there. And then a lot of information about where you were, because again, I don't have the kind of intimate knowledge of your communities that you do, so giving me good information and even attaching a map is really helpful. And then contact information, name of all the people who were involved, because we do periodically like to reach out to everybody, or last year we sent everybody a certificate for participating, and it's nice to be able to keep track of everybody who's been involved. Someday maybe I'd have an opportunity to apply for a grant, for example. It would be nice to be able to identify how many people have been engaged and how many amphibians they saved and so forth. And this is the back side, and this is basically where you have a list of species, and you can write in any that are not here, and there's opportunities to, if you don't know what it is, there's unknown frog and unknown salamander. If you can figure out the direction of travel, if they're all heading east, then you'll just indicate east, like down here as an example. And you could just kind of keep hash marks, keeping track of how many live and how many dead you see, and then eventually tally it up at the end of the night. I also suggest sometimes the sheets get pretty messy. I can print some out on Write in the Rain paper. If you let me know ahead of time, I can mail them to you. Or what I suggest is bring out, a piece that maybe you're going to use as scrap paper in the field, and then transfer it over neatly when you get home and you're in a dry place. And then how many of the animals that you saw did you actually help cross the road? Any additional comments? If you use GPS, that's great, but now in the day of Google Earth and maps that you can identify so closely where you are, it doesn't even matter. I don't really need the GPS point. And did you send any photos? And that's it. And so it's pretty straightforward. And again, I'm trying to keep it simple just so that more volunteers feel comfortable participating. And so kind of to wrap up, what else can you do in terms of trying to conserve these species is, get involved in community processes in your town. If you're meeting about open space planning, if you're meeting about wetland laws, if you're meeting about, working with local land trust on conservation easements and so forth, get involved and help educate other people. And encouraging proactive land use planning and stewardship is great. And as I mentioned, Rhinebeck has this great resource. And this is actually the page from the Habitat report that shows all those purple circles are actually all the vernal pools that were mapped in the town of Rhinebeck with buffered areas. And so, if you're trying to find a place, I don't know, how many of you are from Rhinebeck? Oh, all right. So and so depending on what community you live, your town might, a lot of towns in Dutchess County worked with Hudsonia to get habitat maps. So there's usually a page in the report, something like this. But you could, use this information to try to maybe pinpoint places you want to go scouting if you're interested in doing that. And the Environmental Commission might be a good place to talk to about where to get the maps if you don't know already. And then finally, just helping communicate some of these ideas and conservation strategies to your local leaders and to your neighbors, and just getting more and more people involved, I think, is a really good way that we can see less of this sort of thing where you have development right up against a pool, so that pool is no longer functioning, and see less roadkill, and instead see more functioning woodland pools where we get egg masses. We have kids who get to go out and enjoy that for many generations, and we all benefit because we have healthy forests and hopefully healthy wetlands throughout the watershed that are not only good for us, they're good for the Hudson River, they're good for all the associated wildlife and our human communities as well. So that's where I'm going to end. And although I will share with you this great little comic that was in the Millerton News a few years ago. If you can't read it, it says, "Keep going, you're a salamander, not a deer." I liked that. But in any case, I'm happy to hang out and take questions. And I don't know if the Environmental Commission or Land Trust had anything to announce or mention, but I will also tell you guys that just north of here, the Columbia Land Conservancy has a whole series of events starting actually on Sunday, but through this weekend through May, different programs on wetland conservation and woodland pool stewardship by private landowners. And we're going to be doing a 4-hour workshop especially for planning and zoning board members about planning for woodland pools, and we'll get out and see a pool. This Sunday, I'm just giving a lecture actually just about wetlands, and we're showing a short documentary that was made in New Paltz about wetland conservation. But anyway, so if you go to the Columbia Land Conservancy website, there's a whole schedule of all the events about woodland pools and wetland conservation coming up this spring, and now, actually, too. So,
Laura,
yeah.
I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
First question, I get a little bit,
Squeamish?
touch it.
Yeah.
Can I use non-latex gloves? Is that safe?
That's a great question. Why? Let me look into it. I don't know if anybody's ever done that. I mean, I haven't talked to other practitioners. Yeah, no, but I mean, just because one of the best resources for information in putting this project together was other states. I really learned a lot from what other states were doing. And so let me look into it. And if I get your email before you leave tonight, I'll follow up.
Okay, and the other observation that we've had is we found a lot of times that it's very successful if you have a group that is going out.
Yeah.
To have someone driving a car, headlights on,
Mm-hmm.
and then 3 or 4 people walking ahead.
Oh.
You can see, dozens of
If it's not a busy road, and you don't have to worry about traffic.
And are, and you just drive along, and you can just see them
walkers too.
forever
Mm-hmm.
in front of you.
That's great. Where did you do that? What town?
Right here in Rhinebeck
Oh.
on Primrose Hill.
Oh, great. Okay.
Oh, just
Have you
fine.
submitted data? Oh, these are okay, great. I know that Primrose Hill.
Let me tell everybody this quick story. And when we went out, we would remember where we heard peepers, and that's a pretty good indicator. Why don't you move to the front?
Sure.
Driving around and hear peepers. In the certain stretch of Primrose Hill Road, we went out, and the one one night you sent us an alert, and we picked up, a lot of people have heard this story, but we picked up maybe, I don't know, maybe 10 frogs and maybe 4 salamanders. And that very same stretch of road, the very next night you got sent out an alert, and we picked up over 180 spotted salamanders, the very same stretch of road. And what we did is that we started at one end, and we went to where we didn't see them anymore, and we turned around, and they just kept coming.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it?
A half-a-mile stretch for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And they just kept coming.
Yeah, I mean, if you've never experienced it, it's incredible to see hundreds of amphibians all, you know, on a mission to go breed.
Yeah,
it's really incredible.
What's important to know is that if you pick them all up, don't go off to another
Right.
road. Go back again.
Yeah, and it, you know, you go out for as long as you're comfortable, but generally, it seems like the window from like 8 p.m. to 12 a.m., you know, it seems like that's where a lot of our volunteers have been out. I don't expect people to be out till 3, you know, 4 in the morning. Yeah, right.
Like 2 or 3 nights a year.
Right, right. It's true. Well, that's the other thing is that after a lot of traffic winds down after 10 p.m., so there's less risk for the amphibians. Yeah.
Is there any possibility some of the towns that have good spots, like I'm thinking Columbia County, why can't they, when the peak period comes, just put barriers up and let them divert? It isn't like there's no other roads to get where you're going. Why go through a
Right. That's a great question. And I actually used to have that in my slides because that's, so the question was about closing basically stretches of roads. And I don't feel at this point confident enough in all the information we've collected to be able to make recommendations of where those places are just yet, just because I still am working through the data. But that's what I would love to be able to do, you know, not to tell a town they need to close a road, but basically to deliver that information to a town, let them know where those places are, and then maybe let the Environmental Commission or, you know, different community groups get involved with how would that work in their municipality, you know, to close a road for a temporary amount of time. That's what's happened in a lot of other states. And that's kind of how I started getting the idea, was reading about these states that were closing roads during these migrations where there was mortality of like thousands of amphibians, you know, just so many things crossing on busy roads. So, so certainly that's one of the, I'm glad you brought that up. That's one of the ways that we could try to make adjustments to better accommodate this, this phenomenon, this amazing event.
So we put underground migration tunnels under the road.
Right, and there is a tunnel that was done up in Albany that I have yet to make it to get out there to see it myself. But in Europe, I think salamander tunnels are a lot more common than we see here. Yeah.
And do these animals find this?
Well, it requires usually not just the tunnel, but actually creating some kind of barrier that's going to end up leading them there. You know what I mean? So if you know there's maybe, oh, I don't know, a stretch that's 500 feet, you might have to have some kind of curbing or something that's going to try to help guide them into using that spot. That's generally true for all kind of wildlife tunnels, like with turtles, you know, that they really need to have some kind of barrier that's going to prevent them from crossing anywhere in that stretch other than underneath through the culvert or whatever it is. Yeah.
You know, I just want to mention because it really kind of bothered me. I was involved with the reptile Amphibian
Atlas?
research,
Yeah.
And right after it ended, I had always gone on this particular road because it's swamps on both sides. 9 years, and I had never seen a spotted salamander, a spotted turtle.
Oh,
And I had to find him
squashed?
on the edge of the road. Someone purposely went out of their way
Right.
to run him over, and I'd never seen one live.
Oh.
I had to find a dead one to find out.
Yeah.
But I just don't understand how anyone could do
You're right. I don't either. I don't either. Oh, you triggered another thought in my head about, well, I don't know. Somebody else had a question, I thought. Maybe in the back? Did you have a question? No? Yeah.
Just another thing to remember is, I know that big night, or maybe 1 or 2 big nights
Yeah.
have happened, but the days on either side, you can go out, I mean, we take walks early in the morning, we'll still see little red Fs crossing.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Oh.
So, I mean, it's like, it just pays to be vigilant
Right.
on either side of when the ideal time is.
Right, right.
Still out.
And you just triggered what my memory of what I wanted to say. A lot of people will also maybe write to me in June and say, oh, we just had the summer rain and there was all these frogs out. Are you interested? Of course I'm interested and I care. I don't have the capacity to handle observations from throughout the year. So that's why we're kind of focusing on this phenomenon, because there is like this explosive migration that's happening, and it is a group of species that we know are declining, and we also know they're vulnerable because their breeding habitat is relatively unprotected. So while I'm interested, I really limit the data collection to the time of year that these guys are moving. Yeah, Mita, you do have a question?
You said they were going back and forth. Do we know how long they actually spend in the pond?
Usually about 2 weeks, maybe. That's what usually the most of the literature says they're there for like a week or two. And part of it might be that they're staying somewhere kind of in the buffer area, you know, before they actually enter the pool. There's the spotted salamanders. They call it a congress, where they all kind of gather, and they actually do this kind of dance in the water for the males, for the females. Yeah, I mean, and so that's another fascinating thing. If you know where there's a pool, actually being there when they're moving into the pool is pretty amazing. There's one that we go to in New Paltz, and you have to watch where you're walking, because when you're walking through wet leaves, it's really difficult to see them. But when you see them in the water and they do this like kind of spiraling dance, and if you go on YouTube, you can find lots of videos that people have taken underwater, you know, of vernal pools. And I've found some great footage of marbled salamander, like a female guarding her eggs. And but you know, once their eggs are deposited, it's not like there's parental care. It's like turtles. They just deposit the eggs and they leave. So they're not there for very long.
Laura?
Yeah.
I just want to mention that Winnakee, as a co-host, that you're coming
Yeah.
tonight, one of the things that we want to try to do is organize an educational event, probably in Rhinebeck, and working with Lisa too and the CAB, sorry. And it probably won't be until midnight on the night that we do it, but we will get the word out and try to get some younger people to
Great.
one of the hot spots. So if anybody will use the list of all the attendees tonight and notify everybody. But if anybody has a particular hot spot you think would work in terms of safety and traffic, traffic of the animals and traffic safety of cars, let us know. And anybody here, of course, is welcome to come and participate in that. You know, I think it'd be fun to be with a lot of people.
That's great. And that's what I had originally envisioned and hoped for this project, was that eventually, you know, maybe some of our conservation partners like land trusts and like environmental commissions or boards would eventually maybe organize some local efforts. Because like I said, you guys are all on the ground and know your communities best and know you have contacts of other people who could volunteer. And it could kind of create a life of its own where towns have their own initiatives then, you know, going on, where they figure out ways to either close the roads or get groups that maybe adopt a road and go out there every year. And we just could receive the data, you know, and try to make sure that there's an opportunity to use that for something at even the regional or state scale at some point too. But right now, this project only is happening in the Hudson Valley. We have the unique opportunity, the Estuary program, to kind of integrate this into the work we're doing with towns.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that these maps live in the town hall. They're downstairs. They're available to any resident. Pull out and look. And then we can also, on the Conservation Advisory Board, make maps for any parcel in the town of Rhinebeck. So you can email us and you can give me a couple of days and I'll send you out a map that's just for your parcel and parcels that you identify as places that you see this happening.
That's great. And what's tricky with the pools is that terrestrial forested area, it often you may have a pool on your property, but the terrestrial forested area may actually go into your neighbor's land or maybe multiple neighbors' land. So, so from the planning perspective, we're often encouraging planning boards to not just look at the site plan view, but really to look beyond that, to think about how does the site plan, you know, where a particular project is proposed, how does that relate to the surrounding area? And, you know, as landowners, you know, you might be interested in doing the same and thinking about, I know in some, I'm interested in learning more about the neighbor woods idea, where you think about collectively your neighborhood of woods, you know, and how does it connect and, you know, what kind of habitat is it providing? So, and that's certainly, I imagine Winnakee has, you know, opportunities to think about that with landowners that you work with too.
Well, we do that now when we present our maps.
Yes.
We don't just present one map of that parcel.
Right.
I'll do 6 or 8 layers.
It's great.
We just start building out so you get a bird's eye view by the time you're finished and you can see where it all connects. And I'll pinpoint where it connects.
Yeah.
I'll find that, like I like that other way of making the, you know, the conservation
Right.
zone. You know, they don't all connect in these nice circles.
Right, right.
That way out there.
No, but and that approach that you use is one of the reasons why Rhinebeck is one of our case studies that we often point to as being a great you know, the Conservation Advisory Board is really doing great things with the mapping and informing the planning board. And we talk, you know, one of the strategies we have is to talk to communities about what other communities are doing that might work for them. And so Rhinebeck has been a model that we really applaud. So
as we move forward, if we get these maps and you were to plot on these maps where the
Yeah.
migration happens, then we can migrate those onto the maps, and then we can start building.
That'd be massive
more
migration.
detailed maps.
Yeah.
And then, you know, we can pass them out, and we'll know
Right.
from year to year where everything's happening.
Yeah, and that's great. That's great. And yeah, any help from the local level is really appreciated. And yeah, thanks so much to the Conservation Advisory Board in Winnakee for inviting me to do this tonight.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Yeah.